She had always thought of herself as ordinary, the kind of woman who lived her life quietly without much fuss or drama. Her name was Emily Carter, 32 years old, working at a small-town library where the most excitement she usually had was when the local kids begged her to find a missing comic book or when someone returned a novel 3 months overdue. She had grown up in the countryside, raised by her grandfather who had taught her a few things most people in her town never really knew about her. He had been an old war veteran, the kind of man who believed that every person, no matter their station in life, should understand self-reliance. When she was young, he had taken her out behind their farmhouse and shown her how to handle an old hunting rifle. At first it was just about safety and responsibility, but as she grew she discovered she had an unusual steadiness in her hands, an ability to focus so sharply that the rest of the world seemed to fade away. It was something she had never boasted about, never shared, because she thought it was just a quirk, a skill without any real place in her quiet life. But one summer afternoon, when she decided to spend her weekend at the local shooting range just to clear her head from the monotony of her days, she found herself standing beside men who treated her like she was nothing more than a hobbyist, someone passing time with no real skill. They chuckled under their breath when she signed her name on the logbook, glancing at her small frame, her simple clothes, and the nervous way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. What Emily didn't know was that one of those men wasn't just another shooter. He was a retired Navy SEAL, broad-shouldered, scarred from missions no one would ever hear about, and carrying an aura of unshakable confidence. His name was Daniel Cross, though she didn't know it yet, and when his sharp eyes flicked to her, he judged her in the same way most of the others did, assuming she would miss every shot, maybe even struggle to handle the recoil. For a long moment, Emily considered just leaving, saving herself from the quiet mockery she felt vibrating around her. But then she remembered her grandfather's voice, stern and steady, telling her that skill wasn't about impressing others, it was about knowing yourself. So, she picked up the range's standard rifle, loaded a round and stepped into position. Her breathing slowed, the chatter behind her softened, and the world collapsed into the narrow frame of the target in front of her. She squeezed the trigger once, the sound of the shot cracking through the air, and the bullet drove straight into the center ring with surgical precision. At first, no one reacted, they thought it was luck. Then she fired again and again, each shot hitting dead center until the paper target looked like it had been burned out by a single hole. Silence spread through the range, the kind of silence that prickled the skin, until even Daniel Cross lowered his own weapon and simply stared. The smirk that had curled at the edges of his mouth earlier vanished, replaced by something else, curiosity, respect, and perhaps the faintest trace of disbelief. Emily lowered the rifle slowly, not out of arrogance but out of habit, placing it back on the table with the same care she gave to fragile library books. She turned slightly, noticing for the first time that the entire row of shooters had gone quiet. But her eyes locked with Daniel's, and in that moment she realized she had unsettled a man who had faced war zones, hostile fire, and death itself. She hadn't meant to prove anything, yet her simple, precise shot had done more than just pierce a target. It had shattered assumptions. For Emily, it was just another day, just another skill she had always kept to herself. For Daniel, it was the first time in years that something as simple as a bullet on paper had left him without words. Daniel Cross had been around firearms his entire adult life, trained with the best marksmen the military could produce, and had seen impossible shots made under the most unforgiving conditions. But there was something about the woman standing across from him that unsettled him in a way he couldn't put into words. She didn't have the stance of someone who lived in a world of tactical training or hours of grueling drills, yet her every movement was precise, almost instinctive, as though the rifle was an extension of her own body. He kept his gaze fixed on her as she calmly prepared another round, watching her fingers move with quiet efficiency, and he wondered if she even knew how extraordinary she was. Most shooters, even skilled ones, betrayed themselves in small ways: the faint tremor of nerves, the unnecessary adjustment of grip, the hesitation before pulling the trigger, but she showed none of that. The air in the range seemed to shift, curiosity pulling more eyes toward her as she raised the rifle again and sent another flawless shot through the same tight circle. A young man 2 stalls down whispered to his friend, not quietly enough, something about how she must have cheated or gotten lucky, but Daniel knew better. Luck didn't repeat itself with such unwavering consistency, not at this level. What intrigued him most was not just her accuracy but her composure. She didn't glow with pride or bask in the stunned silence around her. Instead, she looked almost uncomfortable with the attention, as though she wished the floor would swallow her up before anyone asked questions. He set his own rifle down, a decision that surprised him because competition had always been second nature to him, but this wasn't about showing her up, it was about understanding her. As she stepped back from the firing line, brushing a bit of dust from her jeans, Daniel finally moved closer, his boots heavy on the concrete, drawing her attention whether she wanted it or not. "You ever compete?" he asked, his voice low, rough around the edges, carrying that authoritative tone of someone used to commanding. Emily blinked at him, caught off guard, and shook her head quickly. "No," she said softly, her tone modest, almost apologetic. "Just practice sometimes." He studied her carefully, noting how she avoided direct eye contact, the way her fingers fidgeted against the hem of her shirt like she wanted to vanish from the spotlight. "That wasn't just practice," he said finally, and though he didn't mean it as a compliment, the truth was obvious in his tone. She gave a faint shrug, trying to dismiss it, but Daniel wasn't so easily satisfied. He had seen natural talent before, but rarely in someone so unassuming, someone who looked like she belonged more behind a desk than holding a rifle. The other shooters were still whispering, some stealing glances at her, some pretending to be absorbed in their own targets, but the quiet weight of their attention was impossible to ignore. Emily gathered her bag, clearly intending to leave before anyone pressed her further, but Daniel wasn't ready to let her walk away. Something about her ability gnawed at him, a mystery he needed to unravel. He stepped in front of her, not blocking her rudely but firmly enough that she paused. "I've trained with the best," he said, his eyes locked onto hers, "and I don't go silent easy. What you did back there, most people spend years trying to touch that kind of precision." Emily swallowed, a faint flush rising to her cheeks, and she shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "It's just something I learned a long time ago," she murmured. Not offering more, but her voice carried a weight he didn't miss. She wasn't lying, he could tell that much, but she was hiding something. Whether it was just a part of her past or the depth of her skill, he couldn't yet tell. For the first time in years, Daniel Cross felt that familiar spark of curiosity ignite inside him, the same spark that had driven him through years of grueling missions and impossible odds. But this wasn't about a mission or an enemy, it was about a woman who had walked into a shooting range like anyone else, and with a single demonstration of quiet, unshakable skill, had left him silent, questioning everything he thought he knew about ordinary people. And as Emily finally excused herself, slipping past him with a polite nod, Daniel found himself doing something he never did. He followed, not because of suspicion or duty, but because something deep in his gut told him her story wasn't nearly as simple as she wanted the world to believe. Emily didn't notice at first that he was following her. She moved quickly, head down, weaving past the line of parked trucks and sedans in the lot outside the range, hoping to slip away before the attention clung to her any longer. She wasn't used to eyes staring, to people whispering like she was some kind of anomaly, and it made her skin prickle with unease. For years, she had hidden this part of herself, letting it stay buried beneath the layers of routine and simplicity, and she had never wanted it to become a spectacle. But Daniel Cross wasn't the kind of man who let questions slide, not after everything he had lived through. He carried himself with a kind of relentless determination, the stride of someone who had chased shadows through war-torn streets and hunted answers where others would have given up. He caught up with her just as she reached her old blue sedan, his voice sharp but not hostile. "Hold on a second," he said, and she froze, her hand hovering over the door handle. Turning slowly, she saw him standing a few steps away, arms folded across his chest, the sun catching the scars that marked his forearms like reminders of a past she couldn't imagine. "Why are you following me?" she asked, her tone soft but edged with wariness. He tilted his head, studying her carefully, and for a moment, silence stretched between them. "Because people don't just walk into a range and do what you did," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "That kind of control, that kind of focus, it's not casual. You don't get that from practice once in a while. That's training, deep training, whether you admit it or not." Emily's throat tightened, her grandfather's face flickering in her memory, the quiet hours they had spent together with that old hunting rifle, his steady voice guiding her through breathing, patience, discipline. She wanted to tell Daniel it was nothing, that it was just something passed down from an old man who had believed in teaching her to be strong, but the intensity in his eyes made her hesitate. He wasn't looking for a casual excuse, he was looking for truth. "I don't know what you think you saw," she said quietly, gripping her car keys tighter, "but it's not what you're imagining. I'm not a soldier, I'm not trained by anyone. I'm just me." He narrowed his eyes, as though testing her words against the instincts that had kept him alive in combat. Something in her voice carried honesty, yet something else told him she was still holding back. He stepped closer, his tone softening, and for the first time it lacked the edge of interrogation. "I'm not accusing you," he said, "but I've seen a lot of people shoot under pressure, and I know when someone has a gift." "You have it?" You could outshoot half the men I trained with and you do it like it's second nature. That's not ordinary. Emily's chest tightened with a mixture of pride she didn't want to admit and fear she couldn't shake. She had always believed her skill was something private, something meant to be tucked away because she never wanted it to define her. She was a librarian, a caretaker of words, not a fighter, not someone who belonged in the violent world he spoke of. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked finally, her voice sharper now, tinged with a defensiveness she rarely showed. Daniel studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because I've spent my life around people who pretend to be strong, and most of them break when it matters. But then, every once in a while, you meet someone who has the kind of strength they don't even recognize in themselves. You're one of those people. And whether you want it or not, that kind of strength, it doesn't stay hidden forever." His words unsettled her, burrowing under her skin in a way that made her chest ache. She turned back toward her car, unlocking the door, and without meeting his eyes she muttered, "Maybe I don't want it to mean anything. Maybe I just want to live my life without people expecting something from me." Daniel didn't try to stop her this time as she slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, but he didn't move either. He stood there, watching as she pulled out of the lot, and for the first time in years, he felt the nagging certainty that fate had just placed someone in his path for a reason he couldn't yet understand. Emily drove away with her hands tight on the wheel, her heart pounding, and though she tried to push his words from her mind, they echoed with a weight she couldn't silence. Because deep down, she knew he was right. Emily drove the whole way back to her small rented house on the edge of town with her mind spinning, trying to shove the encounter into a box and seal it shut, but the image of Daniel's piercing eyes and the weight of his words clung to her like smoke. She told herself it didn't matter, that he was just some ex-soldier who saw patterns where none existed, but deep down she knew the truth. He had seen through her calm facade, straight into the secret she had carried for years. When she was a child, her grandfather hadn't just taught her how to shoot. He had drilled discipline into her, the kind that went beyond hunting rabbits or hitting cans on a fence. He had treated her lessons like they mattered for something greater, though he never explained why. "One day," he used to say, his gravelly voice stern but affectionate, "you'll understand why I'm giving you this gift. It's not just about pulling a trigger, it's about knowing yourself, trusting your instincts when the world tries to shake you." At the time, she had thought it was just an old man's eccentricity, the ramblings of a veteran who had seen too much. But now, with Daniel's words ringing in her ears, she wondered if her grandfather had seen something in her that even she didn't recognize. She parked outside her house, a quiet little place with paint peeling at the edges and flowers struggling in their pots on the porch, and sat there with the engine ticking softly as it cooled. She wanted to believe she could slip back into her normal routine. Wake up, shelve books, sip tea, read in silence, but the look on Daniel's face when her bullet carved through that target wouldn't leave her. Inside, she put her bag down, made herself tea, and tried to lose herself in the comfort of her worn-out armchair, but the words kept circling. "That kind of strength doesn't stay hidden forever." She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, and felt a sudden rush of unease, the sense that her world was about to tilt in ways she wasn't prepared for. Across town, Daniel sat in his truck, staring out the windshield at the fading evening light, turning over everything he had just witnessed. He had spent a career in shadows, learning to read people with surgical precision, and his instincts were never wrong. Emily Carter wasn't just some librarian with a quirky hobby. She had a focus he'd only ever seen in elite snipers, the kind who could keep their hands steady while chaos erupted all around them. And yet, she carried herself like someone who had no idea how much she stood out. Daniel wasn't sure why it mattered to him so much, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was important, that her skill, her strange mix of humility and power, would mean something down the line. He thought about leaving it alone, about letting her fade back into her quiet life, but something in him rebelled against that idea. He had seen too many good people waste their potential, too many who had the strength to make a difference but never took the chance. And for reasons he couldn't quite name, he didn't want that to be Emily's story. That night, Emily tossed in her bed, drifting in and out of restless sleep, haunted by dreams of her grandfather's lessons and the stern pride in his eyes. She saw herself at 12 years old, holding the rifle steady while he corrected her stance, his hand heavy on her shoulder. She heard his words echo again, "One day you'll understand," and woke with her heart pounding, sweat on her skin as though those words had followed her from the grave. She sat up, staring at the pale light of dawn spilling through the curtains, and wondered if fate was trying to tell her something. At the same time, Daniel was already awake, because years of combat had trained him to rise with the sun, and he found himself driving back to the range, not even sure why. Maybe he thought she'd return, Or maybe he just needed to feel the space where his silence had first been stolen by her impossible accuracy. He stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the targets flutter in the morning breeze, and he made a quiet promise to himself. He wasn't done with Emily Carter, not until he understood what she truly was hiding, and not until she herself realized the power that rested inside her hands. Emily tried to bury herself in her routine that morning, clinging to the familiar rhythm of the library, telling herself that if she just focused hard enough on reshelving books and helping patrons, the memory of the range would fade into the background. But even as she guided children to the picture book section and helped an elderly man check out his favorite mystery novels, her mind kept drifting back to Daniel. His voice, steady and edged with conviction, repeated in her head like a refrain she couldn't silence, and the way he had looked at her, like he had seen something even she hadn't fully admitted, nod at her. By the afternoon she was exhausted from the effort of pretending everything was normal, and as she stepped out the back door into the quiet alley for a breath of fresh air, she froze. Daniel was there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, waiting as though he had known she would eventually need a break. She felt a spike of irritation mixed with unease, pulling her cardigan tighter around her. "Are you stalking me now?" she asked, trying to inject her voice with enough sharpness to make him leave. But Daniel didn't flinch, didn't look embarrassed or apologetic. His expression was calm, almost unreadable, though his eyes burned with an intensity that unsettled her. "I'm not here to bother you," he said evenly. "I'm here because I don't think you understand how rare your skill is. And because people like you don't just come along by accident." Emily shook her head, laughing bitterly. "I already told you I'm not special. I'm just a woman who learned to shoot when she was a kid. That's it. Whatever story you're telling yourself, it's wrong." Daniel stepped closer, his voice lowering so only she could hear. "I've seen men break down in combat who trained for years. I've seen the best miss when it mattered most. And then I saw you. Come. Controlled. Every shot perfect. You may think it's nothing, but I'm telling you, it's something. And if you keep pretending it isn't, one day you're going to find yourself wishing you had paid attention to it." His words sank into her like stones, heavy and unwelcome, but impossible to shake. She wanted to argue, to tell him to leave her alone, but instead she found herself whispering, "Why do you care so much? You don't even know me." For the first time his expression shifted, softening around the edges. "Because I know what it's like to waste time pretending you're someone you're not. And because sometimes, life has a way of dragging people into storms whether they want to be there or not. When that day comes for you, and I promise it will, you're going to need to know exactly who you are." Emily stared at him, her pulse racing, and she hated that part of her believed him. She wanted to retreat, to close the door behind her and shut out the world, but a voice deep inside whispered that he was right, that maybe her grandfather had known this all along. She looked away, fighting to steady her breath, and finally muttered, "I don't want a storm. I just want to live quietly." Daniel nodded slowly as though he understood, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "Quiet doesn't last forever," he said before turning and walking down the alley, leaving her rooted to the spot. That night, Emily sat alone in her living room, the shadows of the lamps stretching across the walls, and she found herself pulling her grandfather's rifle case out of the closet. She hadn't touched it in years, not since he passed, but the weight of it in her hands felt like an old truth returning. She ran her fingers along the polished wood, remembering the way he had smiled when she had hit her first bullseye, the way he had told her she was different, that her calm was her greatest strength. She didn't know if Daniel Cross was right, or if she was just letting his intensity shake her, but she knew one thing for certain. Something had shifted. And no matter how much she tried to cling to her quiet life, the echo of her own shots at the range, and the silence they had drawn from a Navy SEAL, would not let her go. The following week unfolded in a haze that Emily couldn't quite escape, her attempts at slipping back into normalcy undermined by the constant gnawing in her chest, the memory of Daniel's words and the weight of her grandfather's lessons circling her thoughts like restless birds. She went through the motions at the library, smiled politely at patrons, shelved books in neat rows, but at night she found herself unable to sleep, lying awake with her grandfather's rifle propped against the wall, as if its silent presence demanded acknowledgement. By the third sleepless night, she gave in to the itch beneath her skin and drove out to the range again, hoping to find solitude in the rhythmic crack of shots and the steady calm it brought her. But when she stepped into the fluorescent-lit stalls, she wasn't alone. Daniel was already there, his tall frame a dark silhouette at the far end, rifle steady as he drilled holes into his target with the relentless discipline of a man who had done it his whole life. He looked over when she entered, his expression unreadable, but he didn't speak. She almost turned around and left, But something stubborn rose in her. Anger at the way he unsettled her, defiance at the way he had forced her to look at herself differently. So she took a station, loaded up, and began firing. Shot after shot, clean, precise, unshakable, until her own paper target was nearly destroyed. She felt his eyes on her between rounds, the heavy silence of his scrutiny, but she refused to let it shake her. Finally, when she paused to reload, he approached, carrying his own rifle casually in one hand. "You came back," he said, not a question but an observation, his voice roughened by the echo of the range. Emily set her jaw, refusing to look at him. "I needed practice," she muttered. "That's all." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then leaned against the divider beside her. "You don't practice like that unless you're training for something," he said quietly. "So what are you training for?" She stiffened, forcing herself to breathe slowly, refusing to admit that she didn't know the answer. She wanted to say it was just release, just a way to silence the noise inside her, but the truth was harder to ignore. Part of her felt as though she was preparing for something unknown, some test her grandfather had always believed would come. "I'm not training," she said finally, her voice firmer than she felt. "I just can't sleep." His gaze softened slightly, the hard edges of a soldier giving way to the human underneath. "Neither can I," he admitted almost reluctantly, and for a moment they stood in silence, bound by the invisible weight of ghosts neither of them cared to name. He studied her again, then said, "You think you're running from something simple, but you're not. You're running from yourself. And that's the hardest fight there is." His words hit her harder than she wanted to admit, and she gripped the rifle tighter to keep her hand steady. She didn't respond, not right away because some part of her feared he was right. They spent the next hour in silence, each firing, reloading, firing again, until the smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air and their shoulders ached from the repetition. When she finally packed up to leave, Daniel walked her to her car, his steps slow, deliberate. "Listen," he said as she unlocked her door, "I'm not here to push you into anything. But you can't ignore this forever. You've got something rare, and whether you like it or not, the world has a way of finding uses for people like you." She slid into her seat, staring straight ahead, unwilling to meet his eyes. "And what if I don't want the world to find me?" she asked softly. He paused, his hand resting lightly on the roof of her car, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "Then you better be ready to fight twice as hard to keep it from happening." With that, he stepped back, letting her drive off into the night, but as she glanced in the mirror, she saw him still standing there, a lone figure in the glow of the range lights, and for the first time she wondered if her life was already changing, if the quiet world she had built around herself was crumbling piece by piece, and if she had the strength to face whatever came next. The next few days became a strange dance between resistance and inevitability for Emily, as though every step she took to cling to her quiet life was undermined by the growing awareness that something larger was stirring just beyond her reach. Daniel seemed to appear everywhere, not in an intrusive way, but like a shadow lingering at the edges of her world. Sometimes at the coffee shop she visited after work, sometimes at the hardware store where she bought nails to fix the sagging shelves in her house, and once even outside the library, leaning casually against his truck as if waiting for her to acknowledge the pull between them. At first, she bristled, her instinct screaming at her to push him away, to demand that he stop orbiting her life, but deep down she knew he wasn't there out of obsession. He was watching, waiting, making sure she didn't run from herself again. She told herself it didn't matter, that he was just a man haunted by his past, projecting meaning where there was none, but every time their eyes met, she felt that quiet certainty that he was right about her, and that terrified her more than anything. One evening, as twilight painted the town in muted gold, she found herself walking home from the library only to realize Daniel was beside her, his pace matching hers, his silence steady, unhurried. "You can't keep doing this," she muttered, her voice tight, not quite anger but close. "Following me, waiting for me to break. I'm not who you think I am." He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You keep saying that," he replied calmly, "but the truth is you don't even know who you are. You're afraid to look." His words lodged deep, leaving her chest tight, but she pushed back, snapping, "And what if I don't want to look? What if I'm fine living small, unnoticed?" Daniel finally turned his eyes to her, and the intensity in them almost made her stumble. "Then you wouldn't be here, walking beside me, carrying that storm in your chest like it's eating you alive. You're not fine, Emily. You've been pretending for so long you don't even realize the mask is suffocating you." She stopped walking, her breath sharp, anger and fear and something else swirling inside her. "Why do you care?" she demanded, louder now, her voice breaking in the quiet street. "Why do you keep pushing me when I never asked you to?" For the first time, Daniel looked unsettled, the cracks in his armor showing. He hesitated, then said softly, "Because I see you. I see the person under all that fear, and I can't just walk away knowing what you're capable of. Not when the world eats up people like you before they even realize what they could have been." His words silenced her, and she turned away, trembling because a part of her wanted to scream that he was wrong, while another part wanted to collapse under the truth of it. She walked faster, leaving him behind, but the echo of his voice followed her all the way home. That night she didn't sleep again. She sat at her kitchen table with her grandfather's rifle laid out before her, the lamplight glinting off the metal, and she remembered the way he had made her promise to never forget the lessons, to never treat them as a game. "One day you'll need this," he had said, his eyes fierce despite his frailty. She had never understood then, but now, with Daniel's voice layered over his memory, she felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. She didn't want storms, didn't want to be seen, didn't want to be dragged into a life she had never chosen. But perhaps choice had nothing to do with it. Perhaps fate had already been written into her bones, into her calm hands and her unshakable focus. As dawn broke, painting her walls in pale light, she realized she couldn't keep running from herself. And though she hated to admit it, she knew Daniel was right. Her quiet life was ending, and the woman she had been pretending to be was about to disappear forever. The crowd in the range had gone utterly quiet after her last shot, and the silence carried with it a weight that was hard to describe. The Navy SEAL, the man who had entered so confident, so sure of his decades of training, was still staring at the target as if he couldn't believe what his eyes showed. Her bullet hole wasn't just close to the bullseye, it was perfectly centered, so precise that it looked like the very dot had vanished into nothingness. No one spoke, but everyone knew what had just happened. A simple woman, someone they had all underestimated, had achieved the kind of shot that soldiers train lifetimes to master. For a long moment she stood there, almost unsure of what to do next. Her hands were steady as she lowered her firearm, but her heart was racing. She hadn't set out to embarrass anyone, let alone a Navy SEAL. She had come to the range the same way she always did, quietly, privately, just to practice, just to keep her skills alive in a world where people rarely understood why someone like her even carried the discipline to shoot. But now, the secret she had held close to her chest for years was no longer secret. The SEAL finally turned, his jaw tightening, though his eyes carried something deeper than anger. For a man like him, losing wasn't about pride, it was about measuring reality. He had seen prodigies, trained with sharpshooters, and pushed himself through impossible trials. And yet, he could count on one hand the people he had seen deliver a shot like that under pressure. He gave her a nod, small but meaningful. It wasn't defeat, it was recognition. The others began to murmur, some clapping softly, others exchanging glances of disbelief. She wished they wouldn't. She hadn't wanted an audience, and the attention made her uncomfortable. She gathered her things quickly, trying not to let her face betray the storm of emotions inside her. But as she walked toward the door, the SEAL called after her. "Wait." She froze, her back to him, every instinct telling her to keep walking. But there was something in his voice, a mix of command and respect, that made her turn. He stepped closer, holstering his weapon, his expression unreadable but steady. "That shot," he began, pausing as if searching for the right words. "It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. You don't just learn that at a local range. Where did you train?" Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer right away. No one had asked her that in years, and for good reason. Most people assumed she was just a hobbyist, maybe someone who liked target practice to pass the time. But his question cut too close to the truth. "I practice," she said softly. "That's all." His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion but with curiosity. He could tell she was holding back. "I've spent my life surrounded by shooters. I can tell practice from something else. You had discipline in your stance, your breathing, even the way you pulled the trigger. That comes from somewhere." The murmurs behind them grew louder, people leaning in, waiting for her to explain. She hated it. Her past was something she had buried. She had walked away from a life where her skills were not a hobby, but survival. The things she had seen, the choices she had made, it wasn't something she wanted anyone here to know. Especially not him. "I don't owe anyone an explanation," she finally said, her tone quiet but firm. "Not even you." The SEAL studied her, then gave another slow nod. He respected boundaries, even as his instincts screamed that there was more to her story. "Fair enough," he said. Then after a pause he added, "But you should know, what you did today won't be forgotten. Not by me, not by them." He gestured toward the silent crowd. Her chest tightened. That was exactly what she didn't want. She had come to the range to disappear, not to be remembered. And yet, there was no undoing what had just happened. The truth was written on the target behind them, a hole in the very center, impossible to ignore. As she turned to leave again, his voice followed her once more, but this time it was softer. If you ever want to put those skills to use again, there are people who could use someone like you. She didn't respond. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the fading light of the evening. The cool air brushed against her face, carrying away the heat and the tension of the moment. She breathed deeply, letting herself settle. He didn't understand, he couldn't. She wasn't looking for purpose or missions or recognition. She was just trying to live quietly, to exist without her past catching up to her. And yet, as she walked away, she couldn't shake his words. Someone like you. They echoed in her head, stirring memories she had long tried to bury. She had been someone once. Someone dangerous, someone precise, someone relied on when everything was at stake. That life was supposed to be over. But perhaps it was naive to think it would never find her again. For now, though, she would keep walking, keep living as the woman no one noticed, until the next time the world demanded she prove with a single shot exactly who she really was. The end.